Jeff Mayhew, politics and parenting. Madisonian Republicans? Dad? I don't know. This is my son Oliver. So we do this thing in the car sometimes where he just asks me about random history questions. Typically it's like he's studying something in school, he's telling me about it, and then I go on some big long story about some person's life, and then he starts to ask me questions about it. So I was like, hey, we should do that as a video. We could call it Questions in the Car with Oliver, or History Questions with Dad. What do you think?
I think the first one's better.
Okay, Questions in the Car with Oliver. So, Oliver, what are you studying in school right now?
Right now we are studying World War I, and now we were moving into World War II, more so.
All right, so Oliver's in, what grade are you in?
7th.
7th grade. I'm a good dad. I knew that. All right, so he goes to Ronald Reagan, and he's studying the progressive era, realistically. So I gave him this book. I read this, last year, January or so? Mm-hmm. This is Woodrow Wilson. This is a biography on Wilson. I also gave him this. I said, hey, here's all my notes from the book. You know, there's just little thoughts that I had as I was going through, and I just, you know, I annotate, and I said, I write down the pages. Now, this serves two purposes. It's really easy to organize a show when you have such detailed notes. Second, he's gonna go into 8th grade, he's gonna be going into high school. School's gonna get harder. I want him to know how to study. This is really important. So him going through and seeing how I study, that can just give him ideas for when he's ready. So he's got some questions, and he's gonna ask Dad. Go ahead.
Okay, so for my first question, it is, why do you believe that Wilson thought the Compromise of 1877 assured the supremacy of white people in the administration of the South?
That's a very long question. Did you write that all by yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna go to my notes here first. That's on page 70. All right, so I'm gonna go to page 70 here. All right, page 70. We could fix it in post, as John would say when we do the podcast. Do you hear that? Fix it in post when we do a long time and we don't know what we're doing. All right, so the reason that I wrote this note is because of this quote. This is what I highlighted in the book. As future historian Woodrow Wilson would write, the supremacy of the white people was henceforth assured in the administration of the southern states. Reconstruction ended, but the American political system stagnated in a period which the executive branch was subordinate to the legislative, and the legislative lacked adequate leadership. So this is right after the Compromise, realistically. And the Southern slaveholders, right, that had just lost the Civil War, they want control of their representation. And this is where you get a lot, you know, the South starts the poll taxes and different type of discriminatory tactics. Woodrow Wilson believes that the Compromise of 1877 justifies this, realistically. That's kind of what he's saying here. You know, you have to look at the lens through his beliefs and what he believed, you know, was fair representation. And he was a Southerner, true and true. And that goes for his racial beliefs as well. Not really great. But yeah, that's kind of what he was saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. All right. What's your next question, bud?
Why did Wilson think money in the education system was corrupt?
Page 184. All right. 184. So I had to read this over a couple times before we were doing this. So this is a period where Woodrow Wilson is the president of Princeton. He's going around, he's giving some speeches. This is right about the time that people are like, hey, this guy could be like public office. I think he runs for governor of his state, right? So he's giving speeches, and this is called, let's see. Let me get to the right quote. The Pittsburgh speech not only gave voice to a lot of dispirited Princetonians, but also spoke to average Americans, many of whom considered a college education a privilege of the wealthy. Alumni and zinc magnate, am I saying that right, kid? I don't know. David B. Jones of Chicago suggested that Wilson suddenly become the conscience of the country, and that to, quote, resign a position second only to the presidency of the country as pulpit because Wilson would not submit to the control of education by money and for money. Now, Woodrow Wilson kind of saw this. I like his beliefs on education a large degree. And I think what he saw is he saw a faction of society trying to monetize the education system for profit, at the same time excluding an entire group of people. Back to that, poll taxes after the 1877, all the Jim Crow laws and stuff like that they had. This was a way to manipulate the education system so only the white wealthy people got educated properly. Wilson was against that, even though he was kind of a bigot. I don't think he was thinking that way in his head at the time, but he definitely saw the problem with the education system very early on, because I went through Prince William County education system. You're going through Prince William education system. Doesn't really feel great, does it?
No.
No, it doesn't. But it could feel better. And I think Wilson understood that. So, what's your next question, Bub?
Why do you think that Wilson was pro Second Amendment?
All right, page 377. So this is I thought this was a great question that he asked me, especially because it's a very hot topic. It's something that I think kids of your age probably hear a lot. What is the Second Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. Do you really know what it means? You hear a lot of adults talking about it, right? Kind of confusing.
Yeah.
Well, I think even adults can get confused by it. And so if you want to really understand something, especially about our nation, our Constitution, you got to kind of read about it, study about it, and then read and study what other people thought about it. People of authority, people like Woodrow Wilson. So at this point in his story, there's a conflict with Mexico, and Wilson does not want to go to war. He's kind of this moralist guy who is, pro-life, realistically. He thinks that war is not good for the country, and that doesn't mean he doesn't believe that you should be prepared for war, right? A best defense of not fighting a war is a strong offense of posture, realistically, I think is what Wilson believes. And so he expressed his belief in the Second Amendment, quote, "the right of the people to keep and bear arms," end quote, "not for the sake of shooting each other, but so that citizens could be, quote, ready and sufficient to take care of themselves and of the governments which they have set up to serve them," end quote, with a well-regulated militia. So what is this saying? He's saying you, the average citizen, have a right to protect yourself. You're not here to protect, it's not there to protect yourself necessarily from individual invasion, although that's covered, but it's mainly to protect yourself and your nation. You should have a weapon so you're prepared to fight in war if your nation calls to you. Because you're going to remember, when these laws were written, time was different. Circumstances were different. And the possibility of war back then was always in the air. And I think, unfortunately, it's kind of back in the air now. Whether we want to admit it or not, you just got to think about those type of things. And as citizens, you should be prepared and understand your rights and your responsibilities. And that's kind of what Wilson was saying, is it's your right and responsibility as a citizen to have a well-regulated militia, to be trained and prepared for battle should your country need your service. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. What's the next? We got one more? Two more?
Two more.
All right. What's the next question?
Why did Wilson understand the horrors of war?
Oh, I forgot to tell you. Are you looking at the camera?
Yeah.
Why did Wilson... What was the question again? I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Not understand, but know the horrors of war.
Okay, page 393. So this is around that same period of time, conflict with Mexico, but I think the reason I highlighted this is it really gets into his belief about war and government, and again, he oversaw World War I. Am I boring you?
No.
So he oversaw World War I, right? And so he was the commander-in-chief, he was in charge of this, so you want to get an understanding of that. The dog's acting up. So he wrote, "I came from the South, and I know what war was." He was born in 1856. He was 4 when the war started. He was 9 when the war ended. And you got to think, his whole life, he grew up talking to people who fought in that war. And he came from the South, and he came up hearing stories about the horrors and the devastation that it took on the Southern people and families and how it divided and destroyed them. He didn't want war. He would do anything to avoid war. He was a true moralist in a sense, believing that there was a better way to solve these problems. And I think it shows in his leadership, and it shows in the way that he approached World War One.
Makes sense. The last question would be, how did Wilson's stroke affect the Union?
How did Wilson's stroke affect the Union? Okay, so this is the question that started the game, right? This is what we did on the podcast last week. So, look, World War I is over. Wilson is in Europe. He is got this idea for a treaty for the United Nations. His big key is do not punish the German people. He believes if you punish the German people, they are more susceptible to rise up in revolution, have a dictator take over, and you have more conflict on the continent. The point of the treaty is to resolve conflict, realistically. The European powers don't like that. But Wilson is a strong and dedicated leader, despite what you may think on all of his other beliefs. He's good at his job, is what I like to say. Well, he has a stroke. He's incapacitated. He comes back overseas. The Senate is a partisan organization at this stage of the game, fighting for their interest. Henry Cabot Lodge is a thorn in his side. He's not able to get through his idea of peace. He can't make the argument to the European powers. He can't make the argument to the Senate or the American people. He is incapacitated. Meanwhile, his wife, Edith, is essentially running the White House. The vice president should take control, but doesn't take control. Like, you hear me talk about power a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Some people need power, some people don't need power. We check, divide, and separate it. This is a situation where we want the vice president to want the power. He doesn't. So ultimately, all this is kept from the American people. Nobody is really running the show. The factions of the country are fighting against themselves, serving their own interest, and there's nobody facilitating the interest of the people, and therefore, the American people aren't served. The people of the world aren't served, and I think it kind of leads into World War II, realistically. I think that if you get a different treaty, if the German people are punished, it doesn't happen. That doesn't mean that something else won't happen, something other terrible won't happen, right? You never can predict the future, and it's hard to rewrite the past. But maybe if we're playing a game, right? If we're writing a science fiction novel or we rewrite the past, maybe that's the possibility that we see here. So I think it definitely hurt the American people. That's how it affected in the world.
I was gonna say this, but you said how it would be a possibility. Well, his treaty would have made it where Germany didn't get a dictator.
Well, it's not to say that Hitler was a dictator per se, right? Like, he rose to power. He didn't just start as a dictator. He was able to obtain that power because the German people were suffering. He said things that divided people, and sometimes division brings people together. Like, when you have a large group of people that were suffering, that division brings small factions of those groups together, and when you're able to build those factions together, then you're able to grow like a majority. And once you do that in a country with like a leader like Hitler, he becomes a dictator, right?
Yeah, I would agree on that he didn't start as a dictator, but I see how I'm gonna say this.
It's hard when you're talking about Hitler. You better get your words right.
Yeah, because then you can make people mad.
We struggle to forgive nowadays, don't we? It's hard to learn when we don't know what we're talking about.
Hitler understood how the war was because he was in World War I himself. And in history, we are watching a documentary on all the huge players in World War I to II, obviously. And in the trenches, he was a messenger.
Yes.
And he was to get a messenger from one of his superiors in the trenches, and the French mustard gassed the trench, and it really affected him because it was a life or death situation, because he wasn't able to put his gas mask on because his mustache was too big at the time.
His mustache was too big at the time?
Yeah.
But what does this story tell us about Hitler? Right? So and let's compare it to Wilson. Right? So Wilson grew up, he wasn't in the Civil War, but he heard stories of the horror of it. Hitler saw it. Hitler saw the horror of World War I. And, there's another book that we watched a movie of, it's about World War I. Remember All Quiet on the Western Front? Yeah. That's my grandfather's favorite movie, the old version, not the Netflix version. Anyways, and it really depicts the horrors and the just awfulness of World War I. Hitler lived through that, and then he went home, and his people were suffering. His people, he claimed them essentially, right?
Yeah.
But he was able to take advantage of that. And he, where Wilson kind of was shaped in this way of we must avoid war, Hitler was like, it was revenge. It was always revenge. That's what fear is. That's what leaders that go on fear do. They drive revenge, they drive division. And, good leader, bad leader, Wilson, Hitler. We can complain about Wilson and all the negative and all the flaws that he had, but realistically, in the grand scheme of things, Woodrow Wilson was a great leader. When you compare him to Hitler, he was a fantastic leader, right? And it's their experiences. It's the way that they were raised. It's what happened in the world, all of the different situations that take that into account.
There's actually something else that was in there. He was rejected by the German army. So he went to Austria-Hungary because they were just taking in people. He didn't fit the requirements for German army.
Okay. Well, now you're getting outside of my purview. That's not in my Wilson book. Now you're stumping Dad. Is that the game now? Are we playing Stump Dad? I don't know. I'm not an expert on Hitler. Maybe I'll read Hitler's biography next. I don't know. It sounds really dark. I'm not really in for that.
I mean, I might actually want to read that.
Oh, okay.
Get information. So I actually know stuff.
All right. Well, that was a good first episode. What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah.
Hopefully we hit the record button and we haven't just been talking to the air for 15 or 20 minutes. Hopefully the lighting looks good. We look like professional TV stars, right? All right. So look for us more. We're going to do a few more of these segments about history and questions in the car with Oliver. So Oliver, you want to say anything to the people before I go?
I don't really think so, no.
All right. Peace and love.